Artie Vance survived the war and became a senior research pilot for NACA, the precursor to NASA. He spent his life pushing the boundaries of what an aircraft could do, proving time and again that the most dangerous weapon in any cockpit isn't the gun. It's the intellect of the person behind it. He showed the world that the quiet kid isn't quiet because he has nothing to say. He's quiet because he's busy calculating exactly how to win. The legend of the seven-way overshoot became a cornerstone of modern air combat maneuvering, ACM. It proved that forced drag and asymmetric maneuvering could overcome a numerical disadvantage. Today, when you see a modern jet fighter use a Cobra maneuver to break an enemy's lock, you are seeing the direct descendant of Artie Vance's librarian logic. The sky was finally silent, a vast, hollow blue that felt heavy with the weight of the men who were no longer in it. Artie Vance sat in his cockpit, his head resting against the armored headrest. The adrenaline, which had been a freezing river in his veins, was now receding, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion. He looked at his fuel gauge. The needle was dancing on the red line. He had used almost all his reserve fuel for those violent, high-power bursts during the flap-down turns. He was hundreds of miles from safety, flying a plane that was structurally compromised, and the German radar stations were undoubtedly vectoring new interceptors to his position. But Artie didn't panic. He did what he always did. He calculated. He pulled out his slide rule, the very object his squadron mates had laughed at, and began to figure out the exact RPM and manifold pressure needed to achieve maximum range at his current weight. He leaned out the fuel mixture until the engine began to sputter, then enriched it just a hair. He was gliding the Mustang through the thin air of the upper atmosphere, turning a fighter plane into a high-altitude sailboat. Back at the base in England, the blue-nosed bastards of Bodney were already counting Artie as a loss. His wingmen had returned an hour ago, their faces grim. They had seen the swarm of 7 Focke-Wulfs close in on the quiet kid, and they knew the math. 7-1 against Luftwaffe Experten meant a short, fiery end. They were already clearing out his locker, moving his slide rule and his technical manuals to the disposal pile. Then, a crackle came over the radio. It wasn't a cry for help. It was a calm, almost bored voice. "Bodney Tower, this is Vance. I'm crossing the coast. Requesting priority landing. My hydraulics are shot, and I'm gliding on fumes." The tower went silent. The pilots in the ready room dropped their coffee mugs. "Vance, is that the librarian?" When the Mustang appeared over the airfield, it didn't look like a Cadillac of the skies. It looked like a ghost. The landing gear didn't come down smoothly. It fell out of the wells, swinging loosely as the hydraulic fluid sprayed back against the fuselage. Artie touched down on the grass strip next to the runway, the plane skidding and groaning before coming to a halt just yards from the hangar doors. He didn't wait for the fire crews. He popped the canopy, stood up, and took a long, deep breath of the damp English air. He didn't look like a man who had just killed 3 German aces and scattered for more. He looked like a student who had just finished a particularly difficult exam. The inspection of his aircraft became a local legend. The maintenance chief, a man who had seen everything from the Battle of Britain to the invasion of Normandy, just shook his head. "Lieutenant, I don't know what you did to this wing, but the internal spars are twisted. The rivets are sheared off like they were hit with a chisel. You shouldn't have been able to fly this back, let alone dogfight in it." Artie just pointed to the flap hinges. "The stress was concentrated on the inboard section because I deployed them at 280 knots. If we reinforce the bracket with a secondary steel plate, we can increase the turn rate by another 4 degrees per second." The maintenance chief stopped. He looked at the kid, the quiet, shy kid everyone mocked, and he saw something different. He saw a visionary. Within 48 hours, Artie's notes were being telegraphed to North American Aviation's engineering team in California. His madness wasn't just a survival trick. It was a structural upgrade that would eventually be incorporated into the P-51D-30 model. But the real change happened in the hearts of the men. That night, for the first time, Artie didn't sit alone. The veterans, the aces with 5 and 10 kills, pulled up chairs to his table. They didn't ask him about the fire or the glory. They asked him about the Vance effect. They wanted to know about the drag-induced stall. They wanted to know the math. Artie Vance had proven that in the most chaotic environment known to man, the three-dimensional battlefield of the sky, the most powerful weapon is the ability to remain calm and think. He taught them that a pilot who knows his machine can make it do things the designers never intended. He taught them that the underdog isn't the one with the fewer guns, but the one who stops thinking. As the war ground toward its inevitable conclusion, Artie's tactics saved dozens of young pilots. They learned that when they were trapped, when they were outnumbered, and when death seemed certain, they shouldn't just fight harder. They should think smarter. They learned to reach for the flap handle, to look for the overshoot, and to trust the physics that Artie had laid out for them. Arthur Vance never became a household name. He didn't want a parade, but in every flight manual of the modern era, in every lesson taught to a young pilot about the slow flight regime, the spirit of the quiet kid lives on. He was the man who looked at 7 killers and saw a geometry problem, and he solved it. History remembers the loud, the flashy, and the aggressive, but the sky remembers the thinkers. It remembers the ones who didn't follow the manual, but wrote a new one in the heat of battle. Artie Vance didn't just break a German formation. He broke the ceiling of what was thought possible in an airplane. If you enjoy real World War II stories, where skill and courage change history, subscribe for more. Remember, the quietest person in the room is often the one you should be watching the most. Would you like me to find another story from the archives? Perhaps the pilot who landed a B-17 with only one wing, or the secret kamikaze hunters of the Royal Navy. Mills kept climbing. 200 knots. 180. The Spitfire's controls were getting mushy. He was approaching stall speed. The 109 was still closing, but now it was closing too fast. The German pilot had expected Mills to maintain speed, to turn, to do something. Instead, Mills was just hanging there, slowing, climbing, almost floating. The 109 overshot. It happened in less than 2 seconds. The German pilot realized too late that his closure rate was too high. He couldn't slow down fast enough. He flashed past Mills' right side, so close that Mills could see the pilot's helmeted head turning, looking back, realizing the mistake. Mills pushed the throttle forward, kicked the rudder, and rolled inverted. The Spitfire snapped over and dove, not away from the enemy, toward them. The second 109 was still behind him, but now Mills had angles. He fired. The Brownings hammered. Tracer rounds walked across the 109's fuselage. The German fighter rolled hard left and broke off, trailing smoke. The third 109 tried to adjust, tried to get back into position, but Mills had already reversed again, pulling hard into a climbing spiral. The third 109 couldn't follow. It didn't have the energy. It had burned too much speed trying to catch a target that refused to run. Mills leveled out. His hands were shaking. His breath was ragged inside the oxygen mask. He looked around. The sky was empty. The 109s were gone. He was still alive. Ridley's voice crackled through the radio. Blue 4, what the hell was that? Did you slow down? Mills keyed the mic. His voice was steady. Yes, sir. They expected me to dive. There was a long pause. Then Ridley said, Get back in formation, librarian. We'll talk about this on the ground. The bombers completed their run. 11 Spitfires made it back to Biggin Hill. One was lost over the channel, cause unknown. Mills landed last, his Spitfire's left wing riddled with holes. The ground crew counted 14 cannon strikes. Any one of them could have killed him. Harcourt was waiting when Mills climbed out of the cockpit. He looked at the damage. He looked at Mills. He said, Ridley says you slowed down in a dogfight. Intentionally. Mills nodded. Yes, sir. Harcourt folded his arms. That's the stupidest thing I've ever heard. Mills said nothing. Harcourt stared at him. Then he said, It's also brilliant. If it was intentional, was it intentional? Mills adjusted his glasses. Yes, sir. I read about energy traps in a German tactical manual. Captured document. The Luftwaffe calls it Geschwindigkeitsfall. Speed trap. If your opponent always dives, you can predict their move and catch them. But if you force the attacker to overshoot by becoming unpredictable, you reverse the energy state. They lose their advantage. Harcourt was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, You read a German manual. Yes, sir. It was in the intelligence files. No one else had signed it out. Ridley walked over. He had heard the conversation. He looked at Mills differently now. Not mocking. Not dismissive. Cautious. Respectful. He said, "You could have died. If they had been a little farther back. If you had stalled. If they hadn't overshot." Mills said, "Yes, sir. But diving would have killed me for certain. This gave me a chance." That evening, Harcourt called Mills into his office. He closed the door and told him to sit. The room was small, cluttered with maps and reports. A single window looked out over the airfield. Harcourt lit a cigarette and leaned against the desk. "I've been flying fighters since 1940, he said. "I've seen pilots try every trick there is. Most of them die trying. The ones who survive stick to doctrine because doctrine works. You understand that?" Mills nodded. "Yes, sir. But doctrine assumes the enemy is predictable. And you're saying the enemy has learned our doctrine?" "Yes, sir. They read our manuals too. The experienced ones know what we'll do. So they position for it before we do it." Harcourt took a drag from his cigarette. "So you gambled that slowing down would confuse them enough to create an opening?" "It wasn't a gamble, sir. It was probability. If I dove, I had 0 chance. If I slowed, I had maybe 30%. 30 is better than 0. Harcourt almost smiled. "You calculated percentages while someone was shooting at you." Mills pushed his glasses up. "Yes, sir." Harcourt stubbed out the cigarette. "All right, librarian. Tomorrow morning, you're going to brief the squadron on what you did. Every detail. And if Ridley or anyone else wants to try it, they need to understand exactly how it works. Because if they do it wrong, they're dead. Understood?" "Yes, sir." The next morning, Mills stood in front of the squadron. 12 pilots, most of them older and more experienced. Some still skeptical, some curious. Ridley sat in the front row, arms crossed. Mills used a chalkboard. He drew diagrams. He explained energy states, closure rates, overshoot dynamics. He kept it simple. If you're slow and they're fast, they can't easily slow down to match you. They either overshoot or stall trying to follow. That gives you 2 or 3 seconds. You use those seconds to reverse or reposition. It only works if they're committed to the attack and expecting you to dive or turn hard. One pilot, a Canadian named Harper, raised his hand. "What if they don't overshoot? What if they just pull up and come around again?" Mills nodded. "Then you've bought time. Time to rejoin your section. Time to gain altitude. Time to reposition. You're not dead in the next 3 seconds. That's the goal." Another pilot, older, with a DFC ribbon on his chest, said, "This only works against aggressive pilots. If they're cautious, they'll just sit back and peck at you until you have no energy left." "That's correct," Mills said. "But if they're cautious, you have time to extend or call for help. This maneuver is for situations where you're already dead unless you do something unpredictable." Harcourt stood. "All right. Anyone who wants to practice this, we'll set up mock engagements this afternoon. Mills will fly defensive. You try to shoot him. We'll see how it works." He looked at Mills. "You up for that, librarian?" Mills nodded. "Yes, sir." That afternoon, they ran the drills. Mills flew against Ridley first. Ridley came in fast from above, guns hot. Mills slowed, climbed, bled speed. Ridley overshot, cursed over the radio, pulled around for another pass. Second pass, Mills did it again. Ridley couldn't get a clean shot. On the third pass, Ridley adjusted, stayed farther back, waited for Mills to commit. Mills recognized the adjustment and dove instead, using the speed to extend. Ridley called it a draw. Harper tried next. He was more cautious, closed slower. Mills forced him into a turning fight, using the Spitfire's tighter turn radius to gain angles. Harper broke off after 2 minutes, fuel getting low. By the end of the afternoon, 4 pilots had tried the slow-speed trap. 2 made it work. 2 nearly stalled and had to abort. Harcourt watched from the ground, taking notes. That night, he filed a report to Group Headquarters. He described the maneuver, the principles behind it, and recommended further evaluation by the Tactical Development Unit. He wrote, Pilot Officer Mills has demonstrated an effective counter to high-energy attacks by inducing attacker overshoot through controlled deceleration. Technique requires precise judgment and situational awareness. Not recommended for inexperienced pilots. Recommend controlled dissemination to squadron leaders for evaluation. 3 days later, Mills flew his next combat mission. This time he was flying as Blue 2, just behind Ridley. The target was another bomber escort, deeper into France. The weather was worse. Clouds at 15,000 feet, visibility patchy. They met the enemy over Rouen. 6 109s came out of the clouds, hitting the formation from the side. The Spitfires broke to engage. Mills stayed with Ridley, covering his tail. 109 locked onto Ridley, firing from 400 yards. Ridley broke hard left. The 109 followed. Mills climbed, then rolled inverted and came down behind the 109. He fired a 2-second burst. Hits on the wing root. The 109 snap-rolled right and dove into the clouds. Mills didn't follow. He pulled up, cleared his tail, and rejoined Ridley. Ridley's voice came through, tight with adrenaline. "Good shooting, Blue 2. Mills said, "Thank you, sir." No one called him librarian anymore. Over the next 4 weeks, Mills flew 23 combat missions. He was credited with 3 confirmed kills and 2 probables. More importantly, he survived situations that should have killed him. Twice more he used the slow-speed trap. Once against a pair of Focke-Wulf 190s over the coast. Once against a lone 109 that had bounced him during a convoy patrol. Word spread. Other squadrons heard about the technique. Some called it Mills' trap. Others called it the stall gambit. A few older pilots dismissed it as reckless. But the younger pilots, the ones who had watched their friends die in predictable defensive dives, started experimenting. In August, a tactical development unit instructor visited Biggin Hill. His name was Squadron Leader Pemberton. He had flown in the Battle of Britain, survived 3 bailouts, and now spent his time analyzing tactics. He interviewed Mills for 2 hours, asking detailed questions about timing, airspeed, altitude, and decision-making. At the end of the interview, Pemberton said, "You've identified a genuine gap in our doctrine. The Germans have adapted to our defensive tactics, and we haven't adapted back. That's dangerous. But your solution is also dangerous. If a pilot misjudges the timing by even 1 second, he's dead." Mills said, "Yes, sir. That's why it should only be taught to pilots who understand the principles. It's not a maneuver. It's a decision tree." Pemberton nodded slowly. "You're 19 years old. You sound like a staff officer." Mills said nothing. Pemberton stood and extended his hand. "I'm going to recommend this for inclusion in the next revision of Fighter Command Tactical Memorandum. It won't be mandatory. It'll be listed as an advanced option for pilots facing high-energy attacks with no support. And I'm going to credit you by name. You've earned that." Mills shook his hand. "Thank you, sir." By September, the technique appeared in official RAF training materials. It was described as a controlled deceleration defense and was labeled as high-risk, high-reward. Instructors were told to present it as a last resort option, not a primary tactic. But pilots talked, and the ones who tried it, the ones who survived because of it, spread the word. Mills continued flying. He was promoted to flying officer in October. He was assigned to lead a section in November. He trained the new pilots, emphasizing situational awareness, energy management, and unpredictability. He told them, "The enemy expects you to be predictable. If you always do the same thing, you're already dead. Learn the doctrine, then learn when to break it." In December, Mills was shot down over Belgium. His engine took a direct hit from flak during a ground attack mission. He bailed out at 8,000 feet, landed in a field, and spent 3 days evading German patrols before reaching the resistance. They smuggled him back to England through Spain. He returned to his squadron in February 1944. By then, the slow-speed trap was being taught at the Central Gunnery School, not as gospel, but as an option. Pilots who used it reported mixed results. Some made it work, some died trying. But the ones who survived understood what Mills had understood from the beginning. Survival in air combat wasn't about following the rules. It was about knowing when the rules would get you killed. Mills flew through D-Day and into the summer of 1944. He was promoted to flight lieutenant and given command of a flight. He scored 2 more kills, both 109s, both using variations of the maneuver he had invented. His squadron mates joked that the Germans must have read the memo by now, because the 109 pilots were getting more cautious, hanging back, refusing to commit to high-speed attacks. Mills said, "Good. If they're cautious, we control the fight." In August 1944, Mills was transferred to a training unit. He spent the rest of the war teaching new pilots. He emphasized the same principles. Know your aircraft, know the enemy, know the doctrine, and know when to ignore it. After the war, Mills left the RAF and went to university. He studied engineering. He never spoke much about his combat experiences. Friends who knew he had flown Spitfires would ask him about dogfights, and he would give brief, technical answers. No drama, no heroics, just physics and probability. But in 1947, the Air Ministry published a comprehensive review of fighter tactics used during the war. An entire section was devoted to defensive maneuvers against energy attacks. The slow-speed trap was included, with detailed diagrams and analysis. The report cited Mills by name and noted that his innovative approach to energy management had influenced tactical doctrine across fighter command. Mills read the report once, filed it away, and never mentioned it again. He died in 1998, age 74. His obituary in the Times mentioned his DFC, his 14 confirmed kills, and his post-war career as a civil engineer. It did not mention the maneuver. Most people who read the obituary had no idea that the quiet man who had designed bridges and motorways had once hung a Spitfire in the air at 180 knots, with 3 enemy fighters closing in, and gambled his life on a principle no one else believed in. But the pilots knew. The ones who had survived impossible situations by doing the unexpected, the counterintuitive. And sometimes the smartest thing you can do is the one thing no one expects. Mills didn't invent bravery. He didn't invent skill. He invented doubt. He made the enemy doubt their own doctrine. And in that moment of doubt, when the 109 pilot realized his target wasn't where it should be, wasn't doing what it should do, Mills survived. That's the trap. Not a mechanical trick. Not a simple maneuver. A psychological reversal. The hunter becomes the hunted. Not because the prey is stronger, but because the prey refused to be predictable. If you enjoy real World War II stories, where skill and courage change history, subscribe for more. And the next time you face a problem that seems impossible, ask yourself, what would happen if you did the opposite of what everyone expects?